I have been kindly asked by Rabbi Straucher to share a few words about my uncle, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. I want to begin with a beautiful scene that one of my father's friends imagined in a letter of condolence. Dear Alan, I am certain that when your brother reached Kiseh HaKavod and Hashem and the angels were there to greet him, Rabbi Sachs said, "Friends, let me begin by telling you how nice it is to see you all here today." Friends was a word that my uncle used often. It was important for my uncle to bring people close to him. The other word that he always put into his speeches was Elaine. My uncle was devoted to his wife, Auntie Elaine. My uncle was long walks on Hampstead Heath. My uncle was 10,000 steps a day. My uncle was a yellow tie to brighten his mood. And yes, it is true that when he was 16, my uncle would go down to the beach wearing a tweed jacket. One time, when my father wanted to take my uncle for a walk in the hills of Jerusalem, my uncle expressed surprise at the mere suggestion that he might actually own a t-shirt. My uncle was warm to everyone. When we sat around the Shabbat table with him, he would tell us about the people he had met, famous people, fellow shulgoers, and I am sure some troublesome people. But my uncle always spoke positively. I never heard him speak badly about anyone. Before I get to what I really want to say, I will offer one anecdote, which will tell you another aspect of my uncle, a cute story that my brother Gad told us during the week of Shiva. After his army service in an elite commander unit, my brother Gad spent some time in London working as a construction supervisor. When he told my uncle what he was doing, my uncle recalled a time when he took up his first position as rabbi of Golders Green Synagogue. My uncle wanted to decorate the house he just moved into with new wallpaper, but the price was too high for a young rabbi. So my uncle asked a contractor to come to the house to wallpaper one room. My uncle stood and watched carefully the contractor's technique, asking him various questions. Once the contractor left, my uncle proceeded to wallpaper the rest of the house. There was nothing that my uncle could not learn if he set his mind to it. I cannot say much about my uncle as a scholar or philosopher, since I have to admit that a lot of what he wrote was often way above my head. But there were certain aspects of my uncle's personality which clearly set him apart as a teacher and as a leader. One aspect was his enthusiasm. Whether my uncle was giving a drasha in shul, mixing with students, or just spending time with his grandchildren, great-nephews, and great-nieces, my uncle's enthusiasm was contagious. In fact, the older he got, the more energetic and enthusiastic my uncle seemed to become. He was a little like Benjamin Button. If you want to see an example of his enthusiasm, just go onto YouTube and watch him sing or Seh Shalom with hundreds of school children. My uncle was mesmerized by the musical Hamilton. Makor Rishon, a religious weekend newspaper in Israel, has a magazine section. Each week on the back cover, a public personality is asked about cultural influences and childhood memories. One of the standard questions is, who would you like to spend the day with? The answers are usually Maimonides, Herzl, Ben-Gurion. My uncle replied, Lin-Manuel Miranda. My uncle was obsessed with how Hamilton takes a piece of United States history, which may be outdated and irrelevant to many of the younger generation in America, and makes it so contemporary, so relevant to people of so many backgrounds. That is what my uncle wanted to achieve in his Jewish teaching. Another aspect, the most important to me, is the idea of leadership by example. My uncle understood that not everyone would be a great rabbi or teacher. He also understood that if you set a good example, others will follow. That is the best way to lead. In his book, To Heal a Fractured World, my uncle writes the following. A Jewish lawyer once said to me, "You have written many books about Judaism, but none that answer the question that most concerns me. How am I to serve God in my daily life?" There is nothing religious about being a lawyer, advising my clients how best to manage their affairs, drawing up contracts, defending people against allegations that have been made. I do this 5 days a week. It takes up a major part of my time, but I cannot see how doing what I do, I am performing a religious act, advancing the cause of Judaism, or honoring my creator. Rabbi Sachs continues to say, the question made a deep impact on me. The person who asked it is generally acknowledged to be one of the best lawyers in his field. He is a man of integrity and high principle who inspires inspiration and trust in those with whom he works. He makes no secret of his religious commitments, wears a kippah at all times, and keeps Jewish law. His question was therefore odd, because the answer was so obvious. My uncle answered the question posed by the lawyer by saying this: "It is precisely in our day-to-day relationships, at work or among friends, in our dealings with people, and in the integrity, sensitivity, and generosity we bring to bear on them, that we most add or subtract to the respect those around us have for the values by which we live. Here is the greatest of biblical commands, to sanctify God's name. There is no greater religious achievement." My uncle taught us to influence those close to us simply by being an example of how to live an honest, sympathetic, and giving life. Whether it be his majestic speeches, his prolific writings, the gestures of kindness to those who asked for his guidance, or simply in the way that he lived his life, my uncle was a leader and a living example for us all. Yehi zichro baruch.
Amen. Thank you so much, Miriam. It was really beautiful. I'm going to turn now to our scholar in residence, Dr. Erica Brown, who's going to share with us words of Torah built upon her memories and the teachings of Rabbi Sachs. It's really a great honor to share Torah and to learn Torah from Dr. Brown, but I'm not going to introduce her with a long introduction because it's better for us to learn Torah from her and to use this time to hear her words. Dr. Brown.
Thank you. And it'll be Erica and Miriam. I just want to send my heartfelt condolences. I can't imagine what it's like to be a member of the family right now. So this is the first time I'm actually speaking about Rabbi Sachs. I've written a tribute to him that took a long time for me to formulate, simply because it's very emotional. In fact, someone just wrote to me this morning, a total stranger from Montreal, who had read it and said that he'd only met Rabbi Sachs once, but when he learned that he died, it was as if a family member was taken from him. And I felt myself crying again. So I'm going to try not to be emotional, but you'll excuse me if that happens. So I knew Rabbi Sachs before he was Lord Sachs, and I'm going to call him Rabbi Sachs because that is what I always called him, and that is how I knew him. I married an Englishman. In fact, I'm having my cup of tea with milk right now. I knew it was fated to marry an Englishman because I'd always liked tea with milk. But anyway, so I had moved to England when I was 21. I got married very young, and I knew no one in England. My husband was in medical school, and I did not know how to drive. So I had to learn to drive on a stick shift on the other side of the road, which I considered a greater accomplishment than getting a doctorate. But as it was, the first year, I just didn't know my way around. And when Winston Churchill says that the United States and England are divided by a common language, he couldn't have been more correct. I really just learning the norms and the mores and the way that people interact was a science in and of itself. And we lived very close to Jews College, which at the time, now it's called the London Institute of Jewish Studies. But it's a small building. It's a small building. It was amazing that it could contain an intellect like Rabbi Sachs's. And in fact, only 10 minutes after I heard on Motzei Shabbat that Rabbi Sachs had passed, one of my brother's friends called me, and he said, Erica, you remember the time that you introduced me to Rabbi Sachs? And I said, I'm just sorry, I don't. He said, well, I was visiting you and your husband in London, and you forgot something in the Jews College building. So we walked over together, and who answered the door but Jonathan Sachs? And you introduced me, and I said, this is my friend speaking, and I said, hey, Jonathan, nice to meet you. And your face turned bright red. And only later did you explain to me who you were standing in front of and what he meant. But at that time, Rabbi Sachs was really, he was not yet chief rabbi. He was a very coveted lecturer in Jews College. But if I explain to you that Jews College is a lot smaller than your shul, and I have been to your shul, it's going to give you a perspective that he was a big fish swimming in a very, very small pond. And I got to be a little piece of that pond. And so what I want to share with you are observations on one particular theme that was pretty consistent in Rabbi Sacks's writing. So he was my master's advisor, and in that capacity, I also got to sit in his classes on ethics and Jewish law. And when I say sit in his classes, I mean only a few feet away, right? This was not a big building. Most of the students were actually a little bit older, were coming back for second degrees, or they were coming back just to, for the sake of learning. But you could already sense then that you were in the presence of someone who was just so beyond any teacher. And I have to say, as a student at Yeshiva University, I had some magnificent scholars that I was privileged to learn with. But there was something different about Rabbi Sacks. And it was something that I think was deeply misunderstood in his career in the United Kingdom. People would joke that his playing field included Buckingham Palace, and as we know later on, the House of Lords, perhaps not understanding that one of his greatest gifts and his legacy is what he did for faith, not only for Judaism, but what he did for faith in the United Kingdom generally, and what he did for faith in the world. When you look at the topics of his books, he was concerned with the way that Judaism interacted with the world, with the wisdom that Judaism had to offer the world, and the way that that Jews should be a sort of regal presence in the world, living up to sort of Yeshayahu's perspective. And I know how much his words traveled. I have to share with you that that someone dropped me an email, a rabbi in Australia, and asked me if I could give a tribute on Monday for 15 minutes to Rabbi Sacks. And I said, well, what time is it in Australia at that time? And he said, oh, it's 4:30 a.m. Is that inconvenient? And I said, that is inconvenient. But I understood that people world over have really been mourning this loss in a very profound way, because I think in many ways, he was like Judaism's spokesperson. He was the person you were so proud to put up in front of any audience, because you knew he could speak in a way that would capture the moment, that would help you think about how to think about the moment. Here's a letter. I reference this in my tribute to him. In fact, I actually ironed it for you. I didn't do a very good job, but it was from 1990 to share with me his thoughts on my thesis, and to wish us well when we were traveling, when we were going on to move to Israel. And now looking at his scrawled handwriting in blue, signing it Jonathan, and that handwriting that I recognize only so well, I'm so glad that I saved it, just sort of holding on. But I do want to share with you something that I have that I bet none of you have, and that is this book, Traditional Alternatives. Traditional Alternatives, which I believe became Tradition in an Untraditional Age. This first came out, Rabbi Sacks was not happy with the cover, so I happened to get it because it landed in Jews College, and boxes and boxes and boxes of it. And the registrar of the college said, Erica, do you want a copy? Do you want 10 copies? So I'm sorry that I didn't take 10 copies, but I took this copy. And this was his first major work. And it was his first major work where he brought together figures from all across the United States, really the world, to have a conversation about what modern orthodoxy should be in the world. And so one of the ways that you can get a sense of Rabbi Sacks's greatness is looking at the index of any of his books, because you will see just how widely he quotes, one source after the other. And this was actually perhaps more Jewish in orientation than many of the books that I imagine some of you have read, because he had a specific mandate coming out of Jews College, which was to create a much more robust and rigorous and meaningful centrist Orthodox position. And to that extent, when I was in London, he was developing plans for a school, Emmanuel College. And he did one of the things that I wish subsequent rabbis and thinkers would do. He put together an article where he talked about what an ideal graduate of a Jewish day school should know. It wasn't enough for him to say, we'll raise money for a brick and mortar structure. He wanted to really think about what it is that what proposition we put forward in the world through education. And he did that with this essay on the ideal graduate. And only then did he begin to put a school in place. So his first and when I knew him closest, was trying to give modern orthodoxy. I don't think he would have called it modern orthodoxy at the time. He called it orthodoxy in the future of the Jewish people, how to reposition orthodoxy in a way that was deeply compelling. And I'm not going to share that book with you. I want to share with you an evolution in his thinking, and that came from this book, also not well read by American Jews, The Home We Build Together. And in The Home We Build Together, Rabbi Sacks was concerned, and this is again an overarching concern of his, which is how does Judaism negotiate multiculturalism, and how does multiculturalism exist in England? And here's the example he brings, and I bring it because this is something certainly in the United States we're thinking about a lot these days and arguing about a lot these days. He said there's a difference between being invited to a country home, a beautiful home and you're the guest at someone's house, and you're served beautifully and hospitality is wonderful. There's a difference between that and a home that we all build together. And his concern was that the treatment of minorities in many countries felt more like the guest house than the home we build together. It was you're an immigrant and you've come, remember, London is one of the most pluralistic, multicultural cities in the world. Just walking down any street in London, you'd feel that. And what he wanted to do was create a space for every immigrant, not every Jew, but for every immigrant to be absorbed into the country in a community that is built together, rather than in the shards that are given out to acknowledge the existence of a variety of minorities. In fact, he believed that multiculturalism really had come to an end, and that's how he began that book. And so I think of that image very, very often when I think about the goals of Judaism, is really partly to build this house together and use Jewish wisdom to accomplish that. So I'm going to share, Rabbi, I think I'm the co-host. Yes, I'm going to also use this opportunity to thank you so much, Rabbi, for organizing this. It's just in preparing for it was really very much a solace and nechama for me. So I'm going to share my, I cannot share my screen yet. Maybe now. I think now. Great. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to share this photo. We're going to talk about covenantal leadership, and one of the ways in which he believed we achieve a better society, given all of the diversity, both racial and in terms of countries, how to integrate minorities, was being part of a covenant. And I want to talk about the way in which he defined a covenant. This is it's just such a beautiful photo of Rabbi Sacks with his yellow tie, Miriam. So I'm giving credibility with this picture to what you've said, and just this wonderful smile that Rabbi Sacks had. This is when he won the Templeton Prize, which was a very prestigious prize for those who are writing and thinking about faith and religion's influence in the world. I will say one of the defining features of Rabbi Sacks of interacting with Rabbi Sacks, and some of you may have experienced this if you heard him lecture, is that he would always look up. And it was very disarming because it was hard to make eye contact with him. And sometimes even frustrating as a student. But I understood that what he was doing, I imagine some people might think in a lofty way that he was kind of always communicating with God, and I certainly think that that's a possibility. But I almost saw that when he was speaking, it was looking at his mind, sort of carefully formulating what he was saying, and so that his interaction with the world, which was always warm and friendly. And Miriam, I love that you said about friends, because he would always talk that way. It somehow he was interacting on two planes simultaneously. And that's why I think a friend of mine said that when Rabbi Sacks wrote, it was as if an angel sat on his shoulder and dictated to him. So I'm going to read to you from The Home We Build Together, the book I just showed you, which came out in 2007. And this is what he taught. This is how he understood the covenant at Sinai. When God is proposing, what God is proposing at Sinai is not a contract, but a covenant. Covenants were a familiar feature of politics in the ancient Near East. They were secular treaties, usually between a strong nation and a weak one. They set out the terms of a relationship. The strong power would protect the weak, in return for which the weak would pledge its loyalty and fealty to the strong. The Bible takes this idea and makes revolutionary use of it. So just to take a pause for a second, what he's trying to say is that the usual idea of a covenant is strong to weak and weak pledge its commitment to the strong. And he says that Tanakh, as we know it, absolutely obliterated that idea. It is now conceived of as a partnership as a result of Sinai between God and a people. God will protect them. They know this because he's already rescued them from slavery. In return, they're to pledge themselves to God, obeying his laws, accepting his mission, honoring his trust. Notice the English spelling of honoring, which I wanted to honor. The people are free to choose. The fact of choice is fundamental, for the Bible portrays God not as an overwhelming force, but as a constitutional monarch. The supreme power makes space for human freedom. So his notion of a covenant, and we're going to talk about further about definitions, his definitions of a covenant, is that it needs to be between partners. There can't be that hierarchy of the powerful and the weak, because there'll never truly be a partnership. And a partnership implies a choice, that one is choosing to enter a partnership. And here's the definition that I love, or a description that I love from his book, Radical Then, Radical Now, also published by Continuum. A covenant is what turns love into law and law into love. And if this is hard to understand from a Sinai perspective, I think that we might understand this from a marriage perspective, that the idea of a marriage is that you're entering a covenantal relationship where there's certain responsibilities that you have towards each other. Certainly in the halachic tradition, if you study the Mishnah, in Mishnayot and Ketubot or the Gemara, you'll see the things that a woman brings into the marriage, the man's responsibilities in marriage. But the idea is that the covenant of law is sanctified through the emotion of love. And so what we've introduced now is an equality. His notion of covenants is a sense of equality and partnership, the notion of being legally bound, having a choice in that, and that the relationship itself is one that law enhances the love and love enhances the law. All right. So with that, I want to actually talk about the first place where covenant officially appears. We'd say in Breshit, in Genesis, in 15:1-21. We read this only a few weeks ago in our Torah cycle. I want to study it with you for a moment and then illustrate, maybe for more than a moment, and then illustrate how this would have further appeared in Rabbi Sacks's thought. I don't have time. I'm not a good multitasker. So if you have a comment or a thought, please don't hesitate to interrupt. I noticed that in life, Jews are always interrupting, but on Zoom, they are almost never interrupting. But I don't want to be the only one speaking, so I'm always interested in any of your thoughts and observations. So let's learn this together. Achar dvar ma'ileh hayad dvar Hashem el Avram b'machzeh lemor al tira Avram anochi magen lach scharecha harbe ma'od. So of course, if you're studying this, you know that the first question that you ask is, well, what happened before that led to this? And I'll tell you what happened before. It was the War of the Four Kings and the Five Kings. Those are the parshiyot about Abraham everyone seems to dismiss, like they go on to the big dramatic incidents, but they forget about all these small aspects of conquest. And I'll share with you a framing that has been helpful for me. When Avraham gets his mission in Breshit Yud Bet, as we're, of Lech Lecha and building a nation consists of two parts. There's people and there's land. And if you look across the Avraham narratives, you'll notice that Avraham is particularly good about land commitments. He has cattle, and they're so numerous that he and Lot have to separate. So Abraham builds wealth through that. Abraham makes covenants with various nations. He fights the War of the Four Kings and the Five Kings. He builds wells. Later, he purchases land for Sarah Imenu. So the idea is that Abraham on the land front, on that nation building front, Abraham's actually spectacular. But what Abraham struggles with is this question of infertility, and that's introduced actually before he gets this blessing. That's introduced in the end of Parak Yud Aleph. In fact, I just want to share with you something that Rabbi Sacks taught me in the 90s and never forgot it. He was talking about Parshat Lech Lecha, which happened to be my bat mitzvah parsha, and he said, "What is Lech Lecha?" He said, "Lech Lecha is the mandate not to go, but to keep going. And he mentioned that Abraham's father was the one who first journeyed out to Canaan from Ur Kasdim, and he died along the way. So at that point, everyone has a choice, right? Abraham and his brothers had a choice. Do you continue or do you stop? And the gift of Abraham is to continue. And Rabbi Sachs related that to all kinds of projects that we take. And we approach them with gusto in the beginning. And then, and then they die off, right? The people who are joining the gym on January 1st, by January 5th, not so much. Daf Yomi, not so much after brachot. So we all take projects, and he spoke about, not kolat chalot kashot. As Rashi said, all beginnings are difficult, but all continuations are difficult. So if you're stuck in a project, think of those fighting words, lech lecha. So Abraham, in this scene, does something. It's an act of chutzpah that very few people point out, and I want to point this out to you. And later again, and we'll learn this together, and then we'll read some of Rabbi Sachs's thoughts. When Abraham has just finished this conquest in the 4 kings and the 5 kings, and God comes to him and he says, "Don't be afraid, al tira, anochi magen lach." And this is important for us. We call Abraham, we talk about Abraham as Magen Abraham, the Magen Abraham in the Shemona Esrei. What is that? What is that a reference to? It's a reference to this story. And Abraham, instead of saying, "Thanks God for being my shield and for rewarding me greatly," right? That we just finished a military victory. Vayomer Avram, Adonai Hashem, my Elokim, ma titen li. What are you going to give me? Vanochi olech ariri. I walk in the world as a childless person. Uben demeshek beiti, who demesek Eliezer, ben meshek beiti, who demesek Eliezer. So Abraham says, God, what are you giving me? So imagine that someone gave you a gift, and instead of saying, thank you so much, you said, what are you giving me? And I understand why Abraham says this, because remember back to that nation building, land, people. So Abraham's saying to himself, I actually am successful militarily. That's not where I need your help. I actually don't need you to be I don't need you to be my gain. I need fertility treatments. I need you to give me something. And here he doesn't speak about Sarah being childless, but that he is childless. And if you want to fulfill a dream, and the dream, and many of us have a calling, and there's certain things we have a calling because we might be good at something, but part of that calling will inevitably involve challenges and struggles which we cannot figure out how to surmount. And so Avram basically says, I'm not interested in this gift. Is this a solution? Is having Eliezer, my household servant, who's a foreigner, is that the solution? And Avram said, Vayomer Avram, Hainli, lo natata zara, is you have not given me child, v'hinei ben beiti yoreshoti. Now Avram isn't asking God. Avram is telling God, you have granted me no offspring, and he, Eliezer, who lives in my household, he will be my inheritor. And that's actually, we know that in the ancient Near East, there are many solutions to infertility. Avram's already dispensed with one, which was Lot, but taking someone from your household as a household servant and amplifying their status in the house may have been a solution. But what does God say to him? V'nei davar Hashem elav lemor, lo yirashcha zeh, ki im asher yetzeh mime'echa hu yirshecha. And God said, no, that's not going to be your heir. He's not going to inherit. The one who inherits comes from your womb. Now you can imagine Abraham saying, I did 9th grade biology. That's not what happens. And by the way, I believe that this is why Sarah, who in some way, perhaps because Abraham shares this with her, understands that if this is supposed to come out of Abraham, then she may be the loser in this predicament. And so in chapter 16, she devises this plan to have Hagar, to change Hagar's status and have Hagar as the surrogate carrier for this child. And in addition to this message, and by the way, this happens with Lot. Every time HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Abraham, this solution will not work, he takes him outside and says, think about this. He
He said, takes him outside and he says, look up to the sky. Usfor kochavim im tuchal lispor otam, vayomer lo ko yeh zarecha. He says, count the stars if it's even a possible task. That will be your future. I was very struck, for those of you who listened to Gila Sachs and her eulogy, her hesped for her father. She talked about the fact that there were problems. There was no problem that he didn't think that Rabbi Sachs couldn't fix. And he didn't feel that there were problems that were beyond him. Eleanor Roosevelt said that about FDR, and I was very struck by this notion here in the biblical sense that Avraham has an enduring problem. He comes up with a solution. God says, I don't like that solution, but he says, I need you to be more imaginative because this is your future. And now it's upon you to figure out how you get there. And this is really an act of Abraham's faith, was to actually dispense with his solution and charitably think about God, generously think that God will provide the means. Anyway, as it happens, then they're in continued conversation, and Hashem says, I brought you out from Ur to assign you this land. And Avram says, well, Eda Arashenu, like, how am I supposed to have this land? And it was, how do I know that I'm the inheritor of this land? There are other people who live here. And God tells him to bring a variety of animals and to cut them in two, and place each of Vikachlo et kol ele, vivater otam, batavach, vitain ish batro likrat rehu, vetatzipor lo batar. So he didn't cut the bird, but he cut the other larger animals in half, and he walked in between them. Now, this is a scene that I imagine, for me as a former vegetarian, not the easiest scene to digest, shall we say. And this small but innocuous detail, Yered ha'ayit ala pragim, Pigarim, V'yeshev otam Avram. Sorry, it's all these little red doodles that the spell check enforces. So all these birds came to, I was thinking that this was just a scene of dead animals, but it wasn't a scene of dead animals. It was the momentous time, the moment when Avraham would inherit this legacy and cement. It was, I guess, up to this point, it had been sort of an experiment. Abraham went his way with, on a whim that perhaps he would find bounty, and he was nomadic, as were most people in this period of time. And he searched for a place to anchor. In fact, after 10 psukim, I imagine many of you are familiar with this Rambam in pasuk Yud of Bereshit Yud Bet of Parshat Lech Lecha. Abraham has a famine and he leaves, and Ramban blames Abraham for this lack of faith. But by the time we're in chapter 15, we're really well developed. This relationship is well developed, and Abraham needs some kind of commitment from God, because Abraham has been doing his duty in building a nation, but he can't do it alone. He needs God in a particular way, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in this way, sets a deep sleep upon him. Many of us think about Yaakov's deep sleep, Vayhi Hashemesh Lavo. And so this, by the way, reminds us, V'tardema nafla al Avram. So almost of Adam being in a deep sleep, and as a result of his deep sleep, he gets a solution to his problems, and that is Chava. Although she's going to be a problem in and of herself one day. V'nei ema cheshecha gdola nofelet alav. And the translation here is a dark dread. I'd like to think of it as almost like a great dark wonder falls upon him. And in that sleep, Avram is told that his offspring will basically the Pesach story, the Pesach narrative, the Exodus narrative, that not only will he have all of these, will he seed all of these descendants, but that his descendants will one day suffer, but they will go free. So this is the picture, and he says, and he says to Avram something that does happen in chapter 25. you will do important things in this world, and you'll be buried at a ripe age. And of course, for me, reading this and knowing that Rabbi Sacks died at 72 always makes me feel about how many years of writing we're missing. In fact, I think many of us, ironically, got used to a book a year, as if that were our due. Well, what will Rabbi Sacks be writing about now? So and I want to continue a little bit further. Just with the dream, the sun was setting, it was dark, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between those pieces. So this is a very mysterious scene. And even though many of us learned this maybe in elementary school, it's not at all apparent what happened. There's a sort of sense of mysticism here, that someone walks between two pieces that are cut exactly in half. And the message here is that if you want to be that flaming torch, you want to be that light, you have to enter into a partnership, which means walking exactly in between two things that are divided, but should be whole. And that in many ways becomes the lesson of covenantal leadership. Can you walk between two things that are divided? And through your leadership, can you in some way make them whole? If you can do that, Abraham, you will be the beneficiary. You will be the ancestor. You will have this nation that goes beyond count. Of course, by the time we get to Devarim Yud, that actually does happen. We are more than the numerous stars we're more numerous than the stars in the sky. So let's go back to, you know what, I'm going to stop share. I'm going to invite anyone with comments, questions, observations. This is our first covenantal experience in Tanakh. Thoughts? You're a little shy. We don't know each other well. I'm sorry, I'm not seeing you in person. Okay. Noach is not a covenant. I'm not sure, Moshe, if you want to say more. Thoughts? Okay, I'm gonna go back. Now, Noah, there was a covenant about not destroying the world, but not a covenant between I guess a Jewish covenant. I should make myself more specific. A covenant with a Jew. I also want to share with you Martin Buber's compelling thesis, which is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tries many varieties of creating a just world. So he starts with Adam and Chava, and there's almost a sense of one failed experiment after another. Then Noach, and then right at the end of Parshat Noach, you meet Abraham. It's as if God says, rather than the universal, I'm going to try to do this with the choice of a particular individual, and then try to create through that covenant a larger nation. All right, so I'm going to go back to our screen and look at this observation from the Dignity of Difference. This is my copy. This is an earlier copy. As many of you know, this was a book that was quite controversial. These were lectures that Rabbi Sacks had given initially to the World Economic Forum, and his level of openness was a cause of concern as he was chief rabbi at this time for a number of people in a number of Jewish leaders in the community who felt that he did too much to acknowledge the presence of other faiths. We're not going to go into that controversy, but no leadership is without a controversy. And I just want to share something from this. Covenant is an answer to the most fundamental question in the evolution of societies. How can we establish relationships secure enough to become the basis of cooperation without the use of economic, political, or military powers? The use of power is ruled out by the requirement of human dignity. If you and I are linked, because one way or another I can force you to do what I want, then I have secured my freedom at the cost of yours. I've asserted my humanity by denying yours. Covenant is the attempt to create partnership without dominance. Oh, this should be dominance, sorry. Dominance or submission. So that notion there about the aspect of partnership, again, I want to think about that image of walking between two pieces, and those two pieces are equal. A covenant, he writes, is not a contract. It differs in three respects. It's not limited to specific conditions and circumstances. In other words, I have a contract with you that I'm going to do a certain piece of work for you, or it's a legal contract. And once those conditions and circumstances are satisfied, the contract is over. A covenant for Rabbi Sacks is an enduring aspect of a relationship. It is open-ended, he writes, and long-lasting. And it's not based on the idea of two individuals, otherwise unconnected, pursuing personal advantage, right? Two business partners, perhaps strangers, who go into something because it'll be mutually beneficial. They go into a business deal. That's not what a covenant is. It's about the we that gives identity to the I. There's a place for contracts, but covenants are prior and they're more fundamental. All right. So that's, again, I want to kind of take you through a travel tour of different ideas that he has about a covenant. But this is a theme that travels in virtually, if you go to any of his tables of contents, and I encourage you to do this, because you'll see where he has lots and lots and lots of entries, and covenant is almost always one of them. I think I can't say that in his over 30 books, I've checked every one of them, but you'll see that, but if you do a sort of skim, you'll notice how often he uses this language. And in fact, he uses it to describe as the name for his Torah Torah cycle sheets, covenant and conversation. The conversation he wanted to have was an enduring sort of communication around the major themes of the day that were inspired by his exegesis of a particular parsha, almost always introducing philosophers. Alistair McIntyre was one of his favorites. Charles Taylor, whether it was Hobbes or Locke, or talking about a particular politician who shined throughout history. So he would try to introduce that element of the conversation, but that element of the conversation was always bringing to bear the words of the covenant. So he talks about here in The Home We Build Together, covenant is a binding commitment entered into by two or more parties to work and care for one another while respecting the freedom, integrity, and difference of each. Covenant is politics without power, economics without self-interest. What difference does it make? For one thing, it gets us to think about the common good, the good of all of us together. So from the binding commitment point, and I think Miriam spoke so beautifully about Lady Elaine. I knew her just as Elaine, who was a student in my classes when I taught at Jews College, and I got to know the two of them through many, many Shabbatot that I spent in their shul in Marble Arch. And watching what a binding commitment was really watching Elaine and Rabbi Sacks interact with each other, support each other, to have the kind of career that Rabbi Sacks had, the unbelievable travel demands that he placed largely on himself. He was always moving. He had so much energy. And as Miriam said, it almost felt like it never lessened. It felt like in some way it just picked up steam, understanding that he had this amazing platform of influence and that he had to leverage it completely. He had to use it while he had it to spread really the good word and the wisdom of Judaism. We could not have done that without the covenantal relationship he had with his own beautiful and special wife, who allowed him to shine, who took care of him, especially during some of his health scares, so that he could continue to produce. So let's go back to this quote about caring for each other. It wasn't only about the weak and the strong, diminishing the weak and strengthening the strong so that both could be equal partners, but that if that partnership had integrity, it respected the difference of each other, that the covenant is politics without power. Now, it's very, very hard. I'm saying this as an American. I know that most of you are Torontonians, Canadians. I don't have to tell you that these have been very, very difficult weeks, and thinking about the covenant is a community or society as a covenant. It feels very, very far away. And it's one of the reasons that when I heard that the election results, and then only one moment later, my daughter told me about Rabbi Sacks, and I burst into tears. I thought a lot about the fact that the words that he'd been writing about for 30 years, this was the moment that they needed to land. And now there wasn't someone to say them. And I know that people can get these ideas from his books, but as we all know, and I can hear his voice very often when I'm reading. Perhaps that's one of the great advantages of being a student for a number of years, is to just hear the voice reading the words. But I think a book is just never going to take the place of a person. And I think Rabbi Sacks understood that. And I think that's why he traveled all over the Commonwealth and Israel, really bringing the same kind of language. And wherever he was, in terms of the political experiences that he was trying to capture and reframe in the UK, he was able to do with the same sort of presence and relevance, whether it was in Canada or South Africa or Australia or all over the United States. So let's go to our next quote about covenant. Again, I'm going to pause if anyone has any questions or thoughts.
This is, sorry, I'll go away from the other phone. This is Alan Sachs. I'm the rabbi's brother.
Oh, hello.
I'm sitting in Jerusalem watching and listening and enjoying, but I just wanted to add or direct you or any American person. You said you would love to hear what Rabbi Sachs would say at this moment in time, but interjecting and going across all those Canadians there, access my brother's, Rabbi Sachs's interview with Emily Maitlis on the BBC about Brexit. And he's asked by the BBC, how does the Prime Minister deal with it now that Brexit is going to go ahead? How does he mend the divide? And if you wanted to give some advice to the new president in the name of Rabbi Sachs, take that interview and wherever you see Brexit, put in President Trump.
Oh, thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that. I think now that you're saying it, it seems so relevant. This sort of large national divided issue, an issue that's so divisive. First of all, I'm just so sorry for your loss. Yeah, I'm so sorry, and I'm really honored that you're here. And I intend to watch that as soon as I get off this call. And perhaps someone can share the link in the chat, and we can all be the beneficiaries of that and apply it to the Fishers. I'm sorry, Alan, that the president and the president-elect have not asked me for my thoughts. If they ever do, I will certainly share them in the name of your late brother. So let's look at as we continue these quotes from The Home We Build Together. Those bound by a covenant voluntarily undertake to share a fate. They choose to link their destinies together. They accept responsibilities to and for one another. Covenants redeem the solitude of the lonely crowd. So this quote spoke to me very profoundly. Number one, we've talked about the notion of choice. That was a concept we mentioned right at the beginning. The idea that you're voluntarily undertaking to share this fate, and that's why marriage is such a good description. And I think for many people, when they move to a country or they're a resident of a country, they don't see themselves as voluntarily undertaking to share a fate with others. And I think what Rabbi Sachs was trying to do was to get people to think of covenant in the largest sense, move from the smallest, the relationships that they understood that had a covenantal aspect, to something that's much larger. On the first level is the family. The second level is the community. And Rabbi Sachs spoke very, very powerfully, I'm not going to talk about it now, but very powerfully about the ingredients of a community, what he called the grammar of chesed, or love and kindness, the things that communities do for each other. And I think he was profoundly concerned that in the United Kingdom, some of that currency of kindness was dissipating. And so using philosophers like Robert Putnam and others to illustrate what happens to individuals with the breakdown of community, enabled him to invite people to reconsider those commitments and to think, I'm not in a contract with my community or with my country or with my religion, for that matter. I'm in a covenant, and a covenant demands something else. I think this was particularly hard as chief rabbi, and he was not, mistakenly, a lot of Americans think that he was chief rabbi of England, but he was chief rabbi of a very specific group of synagogues, of the United Synagogue, and yet he not only saw the boundaries far beyond that, but he also took criticism as he tried to bring communities together within the Jewish factionalism, and sometimes unsuccessfully. So the idea of linking your destiny and accepting responsibilities to and for another. Covenants redeem the solitude of the lonely crowd. Would a covenant had the capacity to create a feeling of belonging. And for this, I want to share an insight that came from Chaim Nachman Bialik. Bialik was a sad child. His parents gave him over to his grandfather. They had a very complicated and rather, I guess we would call a broken home. And he always felt as an outsider, and that appears in many of his poems. And he talks about going to a family wedding. This was after he had let go of his own faith commitments, but going to a wedding and watching people dance in a circle, and the circle dance, and standing, and how he saw that intensity, that love, that sense of belonging, that sharing of the joy, but he stood on the outside of it, longing, almost like someone looks in a bakery window, that longing desire to be part. And so I think what Rabbi Sacks was doing was basically inviting people who felt alienated and marginalized in society, and inviting them again to build the house together, to come in. But it wasn't only coming in, it was saying, and it wasn't coming in and then being a minority population who only, remember, and there's so many, Arab minorities, Pakistani minorities, different areas, and Indian minorities that I saw when I was in London, when I lived in London, the years that I lived there. And what he saw was that this wasn't multiculturalism. This was each person making community for himself or herself, their own food, their own language, their own papers, the newspapers, their own information. And now I'm sure that it's much worse with social media. And what he wanted was to break that down by saying, we have a shared destiny as a community, whether that was a Jewish community or whether that was a national sense of community. And so he writes in The Home We Build Together, to enter into covenant, like deciding to marry, have a child, is to take a risk, an act of faith in an unknown, unknowable future. I want to go back to that quote, but I want to just put it out there for us to digest and think about, and then think about these two last quotes. This is from One People, Tradition, Modernity, and Jewish Unity, not published by Continuum, but by Littman Library. And this is, as you'll see, one of his earliest expressions of this idea. Secular and liberal Jews are part of the covenant. Now you can see he's writing here more internally. Maybe chronologically, I should have done more internal and gone to the external, but I was trying to find what I felt would express and articulate his thoughts most clearly. Secular and liberal Jews are part of the covenant, participants in Judaism's bond of collective responsibility, to be related to with love, dignity, and respect. This offends the modern self, which demands to be respected not for what it is, but for what it believes and does. It is, in terms of modern consciousness, an imperfect solution, but perfect solutions are not to be found this side of Messianic time. Now, I love this quote. I love most of all the last part of this quote, because I think that when you come up with a larger framework of thinking about things, it doesn't mean that each piece fits in nicely. There's always this process of negotiating reality with aspiration. And to that point, one of the things that I think is an enduring legacy of Rabbi Sacks is his capacity to inspire hope, which is one of the reasons I think this loss has hit the Jewish community and beyond with such palpable and poignant pain, is that in times of difficulty, it's very easy to be cynical. It's very easy to be sarcastic. It's easy to be nihilistic. But what we want is to feel inspired, to feel optimism, to feel hope. And that was something that Rabbi Sacks, I think, regularly felt it was his duty to deliver. Not only a solution, but a hope that in an imperfect world, we could always aspire to something better. And he gave us that beautiful language, and also sometimes a charge or a mandate. I remember him speaking in numerous places whenever he came to the States, particularly in my community. I always made a point of trying to spend a little bit of time with him and to hear him. And I must share, as a student, it was always, I don't know if I'm allowed to even feel this, but this like nachas, right? I don't know if people think of like nachas related to children, but nachas related to a teacher. When I saw the arc of his career, and I would watch from thinking of those old Jews college days where if I was lucky, there were 10 people in a class, to watching him really on a world stage, or to watch 1,000 people in a room just stand up and give him an ovation after he spoke. I think because they understood that with sophistication, this wasn't a sort of simple sort of evangelical message. With the sophistication of his brilliant education and all of his mind, he was able to turn the way that you thought about a very perplexing and negative situation, whether that be violence in God's name, whether that be the erosion of morality, and just give it a sort of, bring to it a sort of sense that the fight was worthwhile, and that even if we're not winning, it's worth staying in the fight. It's worth bettering our society in any small way that we can. And I know people felt that when they left, it was almost as if a burden had been lifted. Another quote from The Home We Build Together: "Covenant is the politics of quest for the promised land, the place of freedom, the society that honors the dignity of all." And there you see, I think, maybe his most sweeping statement about what covenant is the sort of future that it promises for those who, by choice and in partnership, enter that covenant. So let's go back to this just last thought, and with this I'll close. And if any of you have questions, please, I'm here. Not that I can necessarily answer them, but we do have family members who may be able to. To enter into covenant, like deciding to marry or have a child, is to take a risk, an act of faith in an unknown, unknowable future. I think for many of us, we haven't mentioned COVID at all, but for many of us, we understand in ways that we never have understood to this depth that we are in unknowable territory. We don't know when we'll be able to join with family and friends. We don't know when we'll have Shabbat meals together. We don't know when we won't be afraid, existentially afraid for our health and the health of those we love. We just don't know. We're in an unknowable future. And what Rabbi Sacks is asking of all of us, I think the legacy of his thought, is to take the risk and make the choice to be part of a covenantal society. There are costs involved. There are risks involved. We do have to make sacrifices for the sake of a greater society. We certainly see that with the impact of illness, that not everybody is willing to do his or her part to ensure the health and safety of others. So in some way, there's so many things that I will carry with me, as living and learning, particularly as an educator, having watched the enormity of his reading lists, of the way that he digested material, of the trance that he entered when he wrote in the summers. But this notion that right now we don't have a guide for the unknowable. And so what we have in a way is this invitation to be part of a sacred covenant and community, and to ask ourselves what we have done, what sacrifices we're willing to make to strengthen this notion of making a choice to create a better future, not only for our families, not only for our communities, because Rabbi Sacks really spoke to the world. And I think the world in some way speaks back to him and thanks him, as I thank him, for all that he gave to us.
Thank you so much, Erica. I want to throw the floor open as Erica invited to questions or comments.
I have a question.
Yes, Chaim.
Firstly, Dr. Brown, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really meaningful. And Miriam, thank you so much for your words at the beginning. My question is, did Rabbi Sachs speak about what practical steps those of us who are not in leadership positions can begin to take to begin constructing a covenantal community, at least within our Daled Amot of our interactions, whether that's our shuls, our communities, our schools, not on the level of platform that he had, but just within our daily interactions, what we can do practically to help build a type of society that he envisioned?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and please call me Erica. I have family members here. I'm going to share my observation, but invite them. I never regarded Rabbi Sachs as a practical man. I think that was, that wasn't his strength. I think there were many people in his life who were able to help him live in the land of theory and concept because they were helpful in managing some of the more practical aspects. Again, that's my perspective as a student and a student of old, I should say, of not recent years. I will say that one thing that Rabbi Sachs did emphasize, and I think you get this a lot in To Heal a Fractured World, is the sense that the cosmic significance in the concept of Tikkun Olam from the point of the Arizal, right, of the 16th century messianic view, as opposed to the more social activist, the Jewish social activist view, is that the world is broken, but there's a nitzotz, there's a spark of divinity within each of the shards of the brokenness, and our job is to cosmically repair the world by doing good deeds, by being good people. Rabbi Sachs, I can't say that I ever heard him speak badly about anyone. In synagogue matters, or in the, my memory is faulty, but I think of that, I'm quite sure. I just don't. He thought. I think he kept his ideas, and he brought other people to that more elevated place. And so, I guess on a practical level, I'll just give one thing that I think about is that. Instead of being drawn, certainly on a political level, but it's certain drawn to the hate and drawn into that that black hole, that quagmire of negativity, is to actually bring other people up. So you're in the presence of someone who's gossiping. So change the topic. You don't have to be the police, and enforce. You just have to change the topic and elevate the conversation. I think that was the gift that he always had, is to take whatever conversation we were having and just amplify it to a different place, multiple degrees, if you like. I don't know if Miriam or Alan want to speak to this.
Well, I will speak to something you just said, for sure. I did know my brother for very, very many years. I never, ever once heard him use a curse or a swear word, not once in his life. And you really have to be fiercely in control of your mind in order to be able to do that. I also never heard him speak what one would define as Lashon Hara. He was disparaging, I think, in all of the conversations that I had with him, and there were many, and I would say he was disparaging. He was disdainful of one person only. He was very vulnerable, but he dealt with his, and he when he was attacked, and he was bitterly attacked in his early years as chief rabbi, he basically withdrew into himself until he internalized it, intellectualized his emotion, and then learnt from the process and carried on. But going back to the specific question, it is true that my mother once, our late mother, said to him, "Why can't you write a book that I can understand?" So he did write one book, and I can't remember the name of it, but maybe someone else in here will remember.
I think A Letter in the Scroll. Is it A Letter?
No, that was way above her level, I'm afraid. That was far, far too intellectual.
It was Celebrating Life, I think.
Celebrating Life, with a beautiful picture of Jonathan
Josh.
Lane on the
That was
cover.
Josh.
Hi, Josh.
Josh, where are you?
They're all
Hello.
here. The family are coming out of the woodwork here.
We're all here.
But the book, To Heal a Fractured World, anyone who wants practical advice, that has so many anecdotes from the rabbi's personal life and his personal interactions of people whom he observed and said, that is the right way to behave. I think if you're looking for practical advice as to how to live a life, that's the reason he wrote that specific book, for sure.
Thank you. I actually want to share that in one talk he gave in Washington, I live in a suburb of Washington, D.C., and the only time I really saw him ever look defeated was really about anti-Semitism. That was something we haven't talked about that at all. I think he saw that as, as one of the weapons in the arsenal against creating covenantal communities, was that sort of mistreatment. And I think what made him sound and look defeated at the moment, I can't remember the exact year, and of course he intellectualized that and wrote about that, was the sense that this was a virus that came back, right? That he thought in somehow in Europe, things were on the rise. And after the tragedy of the Holocaust, one of the things I just want to point out, in Jews College was the repository of many, many amazing Sfarim that were sent there across Europe. There was some theft of some of those collections, but they were sent across Europe to England during the time of the wars. So although Jews College was very small, it had this remarkable library, and that was a place that Rabbi Sachs often spent time in. Josh, I just want to acknowledge you and say I'm sorry, and I don't know if you want to share anything, Josh. Not to put you on the spot.
No. I mean, you all said lovely things.
Just any other comments? I know we've gone a little over time, but honestly, we could be here all day.
If I may, first, I'd like to extend my family's profoundest sympathy to Josh and to Miriam. Sorry. My phone somebody just decided to call me at this time. We had the privilege of being at Shar Shamayim when the late Rabbi Sachs spoke, and it was just such a powerful, powerful moment for me. I happen to be a Holocaust survivor, and I have the privilege of speaking to many groups, particularly this week, Holocaust Education Week. And invariably, there are quotes of the late Rabbi that I am compelled to use, obviously with great emotion and with great love. And one that I always refer to, particularly since I'm usually speaking to mixed groups, mixed meaning Jews and non-Jews, was the Rabbi's quote that the Holocaust does not define what it is to be a Jew. It defines what it is to be a human. And that is so incredibly powerful. And the reference you just made about anti-Semitism, another of his incredible quotes, anti-Semitism did not begin with Jews and cannot be ended by Jews. Every word that he has ever uttered is a treasure, something that I treasure immensely. And I have viewed many, many of his videos. On YouTube, there's a library of videos, particularly in connection with the Holocaust. And each one is so poignant, so powerful, so memorable. And I'm privileged to have lived during his lifetime, to have heard him, and to have the zechut to, on occasion, quote him. I must also say, Erica, that my parsha was Lech Lecha for my bar mitzvah. How long ago? 72 years ago. And with respect to covenant, sitting beside me is Queenie, my wife of 59 years. And before we were married in Montreal, we had to arrange a marriage certificate because women did not have too many rights in Quebec. And a friend of Queenie's, as a wedding gift, presented us with a marriage contract, which required me to pay in my lifetime or to provide in my lifetime to Queenie $50,000. It was such an immense figure. It was such an immense figure that a friend of mine, a lawyer, said, "Saul, are you crazy? Do you know what you signed? Do you know what you got into? $50,000? Well, the beauty about that contract or covenant, it did become law and it did become love. And we have been in love for 59 years. She may not agree with me, but that has been the case. And the fact that you brought that up was, I think, for me personally, very, very powerful. It's been a wonderful opportunity to listen to you and to hear Miriam, to hear comments by Josh. And it's just a great, great day for us. And Alan.
Thank you. Thank you. And may you enjoy many, many more happy years in your covenant together.
I don't know.
It was worth every penny. I just want to thank all of you.
Thank you, Erica. Kol hakavod to everyone, and we're going to close here. Rabbi Sachs's memory will live on. Will live on in the stories that we tell, the books that we read, and the ethics and values that we put forward within our society. That Rabbi Sachs really was a person who was Korei b'Shem Hashem, and that legacy and responsibility now falls upon all of us. And so as we remember Rabbi Sachs and his ideas about covenant, and his ideas about anti-Semitism, his ideas about living in a world of complexity, that we have with us within our Torah the opportunity to continue his message. And that's something that we should all take to heart as we experience the sadness, but God willing also the nechama that his words provide. Thank you all.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a very special presentation.
Thank you, Fern. Thank you for joining. Judith and Alan, thank you for coming on. It means a lot to us.
Rabbi, will this recording be on YouTube?
God willing, yes. We will we'll edit it and we'll put it up. God willing.
Good.
Very good.
And thank you for coming on. Sharon, thank you for being here. Sal and Queenie, that was wonderful. Kol hakavod.
Kol hakavod. Yeah.
Thank you, Rabbi. Be well.
Rabbi, do you know whether or not his weekly Parsha podcasts are going to continue, or are they going to take that down?
So he wrote Covenant Conversations for a full year ahead of schedule. So he was writing in advance. And so his office, from what I understand, will be releasing his Covenant Conversations for another year.
Thank God.
But the year will come to an end. You know, I think I will have an extra year. But
they can start it all over again. It's okay. We can hear them from the beginning all over again.
His Torah remains. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Baruch. Thank you, Dahlia, for joining.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much from
We should
Jerusalem.
also put a plug in for tonight's program for Yeshiva University.
Absolutely. This evening, Rabbi Bergen will be speaking on the topic of the Black Jewish experience, and he'll be interviewing a number of Jews who come from who experience anti-Semitism, but also racism in some way, and he'll be discussing their experience within our community this evening. So everyone's encouraged to participate. Miriam, thank you again. Kol hakavod. Yashar kochech, thank you, and makom yinachem.